And good evening, everybody. Welcome to the latest edition of the African American Athlete. I'm Rickey Hampton, along with my friend and frat brother Michael Roberson, coming to you on a Wednesday evening. Hope everybody's doing well. This is a late night edition of the African American Athlete. And Mike, we got a great guest in tonight, one of America's great writers and a longtime friend. Has covered sports at all levels. NFL, NBA, college, you name it, he's done it. Our good friend J.D. Harris, John Harris. Welcome, brother.
So, hey, I'm gonna throw up this 5-minute signal sign here for y'all, man.
Oh man, the show is over, guys.
Hey, wait a minute. Your book is about our frat brother. Come on.
Yeah, I told Rick earlier. I got a story about that too. It's pretty funny.
Okay.
We'll get into that.
Yeah, we'll get to that. And JD, man, I was so excited when I talked with you earlier today, and you told me about the project you're working on, a autobiography of Pittsburgh Steelers coach Mike Tomlin. And it's not a better time for that book to come out to tell the story of this brother who, in many ways, has been a trailblazer in the National Football League because of his longevity and his extraordinary success he's enjoyed over the years in Pittsburgh. Tell us about the project and how all that came about.
It was funny. I wasn't really even thinking about doing the book. I mean, I was in Pittsburgh, and I was there for at least I covered the team for the first 7 years that Mike Tomlin was there, and never thought about doing a book about him because he's in the public eye, but he's very reserved. You don't really know a lot about him. He keeps, his thoughts to himself, and just didn't think about it. I was having a talk with my editor one day, and we were going over ideas, and he just brought the name up, and it was the first time light bulb went off that I thought about it. And I checked, there are no books on Mike Tomlin as a football coach, which I was surprised. You figure a guy wins a Super Bowl, every coach that wins a Super Bowl, somebody writes a book about him, right? No book. And I just started thinking about his career, not just with the Steelers, but how he got to the Steelers, which to me is the most interesting part of the book, actually, the rise to him becoming the head coach of the Steelers and all the obstacles and innuendos and rumors and everything that took part.
Go ahead. Just some stuff about
and so yeah. I mean, it's about a guy who he went to William and Mary. He's from Virginia Beach, Virginia, and went to William and Mary. Very, very well respected college. University, one of the top colleges in America. He was a wide receiver there. He played football there. Played very well. I think he's still the all-time receiving leader. Like, he averages over 20 yards a catch. He wanted to play in the NFL. It didn't work out that way. And so, as his brother, Ed Tomlin, told me, those that don't play, coach, teach. And he's very unusual in that upon graduation, he got right into the coaching ranks, which is really unheard of. You hear about he graduated in 1995 and coached at VMI, Virginia Military Institute, in 1995. So he got into it right away. Went there he wasn't even there for a year. I think he was there for like 5-6 months, did that season. Then he went to University of Memphis. He was looking for a graduate assistant job because VMI didn't have graduate students, so he wasn't able to do his grad there. He went to Memphis, hooked up with a coach who was familiar with him when he played at William and Mary, Rip Shear, got a graduate assistant's job there. From there, he went to Arkansas State, of all places, in Jonesboro, Arkansas. He was there for 2 years. From there, he went to the University of Cincinnati, where he was there for 2 years. And from there, he went to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Unbelievable story there at Cincinnati. He was starting to get on the radar. Colleges were reaching out to him, and he loved playing pickup basketball. And one day they were playing pickup basketball at the University of Cincinnati, and the phone rang, and it was Bob Davie, who was the Notre Dame coach. And they were talking about a possible job possibility there. I don't know if the offer was made there, but it was getting pretty close. Well, his phone rang again, and it was Monty Kiffin, who was the defensive coordinator for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers.
Yeah.
So he coolly switches back over and tells Coach Davie, hey, I'm going to have to put you on hold for a minute. And then he switches back to Monty Kiffin, and they talk, and they bring him up for an interview. So he gets off of that call. He switches back to Bob Davie. He says, hey, Coach, I'm going to have to call you back. And hangs up the phone, and they get back, and they play the basketball game. And one of the people at the University of Cincinnati told me that story, and they said they couldn't believe it. It was like unbelievable. He's on the phone to these two coaches, cool as can be, kind of playing off Notre Dame for Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And, of course, he got the job. Tony Dungy hired him. And he spent 5 years in Tampa Bay, went to Minnesota Vikings. Brad Childress, who never talked to him before, but he was fantastic for the book. Tells some really unbelievable stories that I think the readers will find fascinating. Spent 1 year in Minnesota, and then he goes to Pittsburgh. An afterthought. Nobody really considered this guy, young black man, 34 years old, 1 year as a defensive coordinator in the NFL. The Pittsburgh Steelers, it just doesn't happen like that, right? And somehow, some way, he gets the job. And I spent a lot of time talking about that process. It was unbelievable. I don't know if there's ever been a job search like that. And I write about it also from a first-person perspective because I was covering the team for the Pittsburgh Tribune Review. So I really get into that. I also get into the competition between the two newspapers, the Post-Gazette and Tribune Review, and I get into that. It's a really important part of it. A lot of twists and turns in it. I won't give it away, but I think it's fascinating, really interesting from somebody who was there, who experienced it, not only as a journalist in a newspaper war, but as a African-American black journalist watching this process with a black coach possibly being hired, and the reaction of the predominantly white media in Pittsburgh and their responses to it. So it's really interesting. A lot of personalities that come into play. John Wooten, who I mentioned to Ricky earlier, who I believe should be in the Hall of Fame, Pro Football Hall of Fame, played a major role in Mike Tomlin coming to Pittsburgh. I get into the dynamic between John Wooten and Dan Rooney, the chairman, who ultimately made the decision for Mike Tomlin. Going back to John Wooten for a minute, he is one of the pioneers he was a player agent. In 1 year, in 1973, he represented 7 first-round draft picks, which I didn't know. And yeah, then he goes to the Dallas Cowboys, plays an integral role in the greatest trade of all time, Herschel Walker trade. Goes to scout Tennessee State, school you're familiar with. I forgot the defensive end that he was scouting, who happened to be going up against a young man named Eric Williams, who was at Central State, who totally dominated. Anthony Pleasant was the defensive end, who had a great NFL career. And according to John Wooten in this game, Eric Williams he couldn't believe it, just dominated him. And he basically has to convince the Cowboys that they need to draft this guy. And, I mean, the rest. I mean, he was one of the great offensive linemen until he got hurt. And his career ended on a down note. But those Super Bowl years, the Cowboy, that offensive line is considered one of the greatest offensive lines. So we really tell John Wooten's story. I think it's a story that needs to be told. Tell it for several reasons. One of them show the relationship between John Wooten and Dan Rooney, because John Wooten was the one who convinced Dan Rooney to fly to Minnesota to talk to this young kid named Mike Tomlin. And he does it, and he's so impressed that he brings him back for the interviews. And the rest is history.
Wow. That is extraordinary. Go. I got plenty of questions, but Mike, I'm going to let you start.
All right. Well, just first and foremost, well, let me just get this out the way. I got this Brewers shirt on, but I had to take it off after the show because they're eliminated. So that's a little sidebar. But yeah, John and I, speaking of Milwaukee, John and I go back about 30 years when I was had my show in Milwaukee, and he was covering he's a beat writer for the Pistons. And so this was like a focal point in the time because they had drafted Grant Hill third overall, and then of course we drafted the big dog. So he and I used to talk. I used to have him come on my show maybe once a month, and we would just go through progress reports of what's going on with the rookies. And then it's just got really crazy when Grant was getting all these all-star votes. He led all people in votes. I was like, what is going on? And then so we whenever we were in town, he was in town, we hang out. I was in Detroit. I think I was in Pontiac. I tried to hang out, but we couldn't connect. So we've known each other for a while. I digress. Now, back to what we're talking about here. I have a question about this. Since he's our frat brother, everybody needs to know that Mike Tomlin's our frat brother, proud brother of Kappa Alpha Psi, greatest fraternity on earth. And so nice they named it twice. Okay. Put that out the way. So what was that transition like for him to be a star receiver and now be known as a defensive coach? So how did that happen? Then my second question would be, from his fraternity point of view, what was his mindset when Kaepernick was going through this? Another Kappa. So did he feel conflicted that, man, I should sign this brother, or would this look kind of bad because of all the stuff that goes with it, with Trump and all that? So what was his mindset with his frat brother, Kaepernick, dangling out there? And then how did he make the transition from offense to defense?
Well, he started out, like you say, he was wide receiver. So he started out as an offensive coach, wide receiver coach at VMI.
Okay.
And then he went to Memphis and was also a wide receiver coach. But during that time, talking to the coaches, Rip Shear was the coach there. And ironically, Keith Butler, who ended up being a defensive coordinator with the Pittsburgh Steelers, was there at Memphis. And he was this veteran guy who kind of took this young kid under his wing. And because he was a defensive coach, Mike Tomlin started to feel it was also suggested to him, hey, you know the offensive side, it'll be good to also get a feel for the defensive side. Yeah. So he ultimately makes the transition at partly at Memphis, but then when he goes to Arkansas State, which is his next stop, he does that. Made a detour. It took me a while to figure out the detour because you looked at on his bios, it mentioned Tennessee Martin.
Right.
And I was like, I thought it was a typo or something. And he actually took a job at Tennessee Martin, never coached there in a game. He was on a recruiting trip in Memphis East High School.
Yeah.
And coaches from Arkansas State happened to be there. And they just started talking. Everybody was talking. And these coaches at Arkansas State were like, yeah, who's this guy? Young brother. Said he had a Tennessee Martin sweats on. They keep talking and keep talking. Randy Fichtner, who was the offensive coordinator there, who ends up being Mike Tomlin's offensive coordinator eventually with the Steelers. He said, hey, we've heard about this guy. Who was this guy? So they get his phone number. They reach back to him, offer him a job. Mike's torn. He just took this job with Tennessee Martin. What do I do? He calls the Memphis coach, Rip Shearer, who became one of his mentors that he would always talk to throughout his career. And the suggestion was, well, yeah, you don't want to be looked at as this guy that just takes jobs, but this is an opportunity for you to go 1A, where Tennessee Martin was not at that level. Right. And it was suggested to him, hey, the quicker you can get to that level, the better. Because you remember, these were not college powers.
Right.
Memphis,
right.
VMI,
right.
Arkansas State. So at least, if not a big name school, at least be at a program that's 1A. So you got a little bit more prestige. And your second question, I saw that. I was a little disappointed. He didn't really comment on when it was brought up to him. I remember when it happened, he told me that he wasn't really going to comment on that. So he never really gave and as far as signing him, he never really addressed that, and he never really talked about that situation as far as what was going on. Although he was one of the first coaches, and his team was one of the first teams to go through the process. They gave players the option.
Right.
You don't have to, come out. So he was, as far as that was concerned, he was one of the first coaches to encourage his players to kind of follow their hearts. So, and that's the thing about Mike Tomlin is you have to go off of his actions and the way he words things, because he just doesn't give up too much of himself. In fact, he didn't give up anything to me because I didn't interview him for the book. I used a lot of Mike Tomlin information and great quotes, but he did not talk for the book. But interesting enough, developed a great dialogue with his brother Edward, who's older, who's Phi Beta Sigma. And I told you I was going to get to that story. I'll get to that after this.
Okay.
And he was great. He provided unbelievable insight, as only the oldest sibling and only sibling could. He gave me insight into Mike and to his brother that I never would have gotten. Probably wouldn't have gotten it from Mike, who's just very reserved, very private. Even though everybody knows him by his press conferences, he's a master at not really giving up a lot. It's just how he does it. The frat story is that Ed, who's Phi Beta Sigma, wanted his younger brother to play at Sigma. Ed was actually a football player at the University of Maryland, which I didn't know, a safety. It sounded like he might have been good enough to go to the league, but he got hurt, suffered an injury. But his plan was to take his younger brother after his first year and pledge him in the summer, all season. And he tells me, he said, "Fred, don't you know those Kappas at William and Mary got a hold of him and he pledged him in his freshman second semester." Because I think,
you ain't even supposed to pledge till your sophomore year.
Yeah, exactly.
And suppose, I guess most of the players, the brothers on the football team at William and Mary, I think they didn't have that. They had, Kappa was one of the main fraternities that they had there. So, all the guys he knew on the team. So it was a natural, and he pledged Kappa. So I thought that was interesting. Just a little interesting side story for
greatest school of his lifetime.
Yeah.
Hey, JD, it seems to me, and you were there covering him, but throughout his tenure in Pittsburgh, he has been highly criticized. He has to be the most criticized, successful coach ever.
Yeah.
And you were there when all that was going on. Talk to us, and how did he handle that? Clearly, he's just persevered.
Yeah, and going back the way I did, I'd forgotten a lot of it. And the moment he got there, because a lot of the players wanted, it was Ken Wizard Hunt, who was the offensive coordinator, and there was Russ Grimm, who was the offensive line coach, assistant head coach. They were player favorites. When Bill Cowher left, everybody assumed, the players, the media, that one of those two were going to get the job. Mike Tomlin wasn't, like I said, at that time, he wasn't even on the radar. Dan Rooney didn't really even know who Mike Tomlin was, which is really unbelievable.
And black coaches, even now you can make that claim. They really weren't being looked at back then.
No, it was the early stages of the Rooney Rule. So it still really hadn't taken hold yet. So he comes in here young, and he's 34 years old on top of everything else. At that time, he was the youngest coach pretty much in the league. The league didn't hire 34-year-old coaches back then. They certainly didn't hire 34-year-old black coaches back then. So he's coming into all of that. And everybody figures it's going to be Russ Grimm. And then Ken Wisenhunt gets the Arizona job.
Right.
So he's out of the mix. Ron Rivera was also in the mix. And it's interesting that the Rooney Rule, which was there at that time, teams had to interview at least one candidate of color for any head coaching vacancy. So the Steelers did interview Ron Rivera, and it was taught to me by John Wooten that they interviewed another minority coach. He wouldn't tell me who it was because he said he's still in the league. So people don't really know that they interviewed two minority candidates. before they even interviewed Mike Tomlin. So the Rooneys, Dan Rooney had already satisfied the Rooney Rule requirement, which was named after him, because he was at that time he was the owner that was in charge of that diversity committee and was very committed to it. So interviewing Mike Tomlin, a lot of people think, well, they interviewed him because of the Rooney Rule. Well, technically, they didn't have to interview him because, as most teams do, once they satisfy the requirement, they go on and end up hiring who they want to hire. But the Steelers had already done that, and John Wooten, his relationship with Dan Rooney, interesting enough, John Wooten played for the Cleveland Browns. He replaced Chuck Noll at guard for the Cleveland Browns. So there was a relationship with John Wooten, Chuck Noll, Dan Rooney that went back decades. So he felt comfortable enough to where he could ask Dan Rooney, he said, hey, we've got this young black coach on our list. They call it the Ready List. Every year they would present this list of candidates to Dan Rooney, who would give it to the owners. And Dan Rooney said, oh, okay, I'll go see him. He could have said no, and we never would have known about Mike Tomlin, but he did. He went, he calls John Wooten back the next day and says, John, you have a minute to talk? He said, yes, I do. He said, I'm really impressed with this young man, and we're going to bring him down to Pittsburgh to interview, which to me was just amazing in itself. Just that part right there, that they had the guys on staff who the players wanted. They wanted, Ken Whisenhunt out of the way. They wanted Russ Grimm. That's who they wanted. They knew him. The Rooneys knew that. The media was presenting this, pushing hard for Russ Grimm, even though I believe and I was told that Ron Rivera was actually the Steelers' second choice, but it was never presented that way in the media. It pretty much came down to Mike Tomlin and Russ Grimm, and lo and behold, Mike Tomlin gets the job. But if you really look at it, in their history of hiring coaches, they hired Bill Cowher before that, Chuck Noll before that, I think Bill Austin before that. They were all in their 30s. They all had a defensive background. So if you just look at it from that standpoint, the only thing the media didn't look at with Mike Tomlin, they looked at his skin color. He was actually the perfect candidate because he was young and he had a defensive background. He just wasn't white. And we're talking about what, 2007, the media wasn't, for the most part, was not able to wrap their head around that type of situation. But actually, he fit the prototype much more than Russ Grimm, who was 49 and an offensive line coach.
And John, let me just jump in here right quick. I'm just thinking about the black athlete in Pittsburgh. There's a great history there. You go back to Clemente and Pop Stargell, and we talked about Joe Gilliam earlier and the issues he had, but Mean Joe Green, all those great brothers that were on those Steel Curtain teams, even with all of that success, Barry Bonds, there's always been a little friction there with some of the fan base.
Yeah.
Oh, I worked
friction is not the right word.
I worked a lot of different places in this country, South, Deep South, everywhere. And I've never encountered, I'm not going to talk about the city itself, but because I didn't actually live in Pittsburgh, I lived in Ohio and I commuted. But from a media standpoint, I never encountered a market which was so negative towards journalists of color.
Oh my God. I was just going to ask you that. Okay, keep going.
It was just mind boggling.
Yeah.
So for him to enter that, that market, that media, it was a shock. I mean, when he was hired, it was a shock. It was a shock. People couldn't believe it. My paper, the Pittsburgh Tribune Review, actually wrote that Russ Grimm was going to get the job. So we go into a situation with egg on our face with this new coach. Oh, you're the guys that wrote that out, so we're dealing with all that. When Mike Tomlin, so he gets the job, right? He gets the job. There are other interesting, and I'm not going to tell everything. There's so much. I want y'all to read it. But one of the things that happens is that, he's trying to pick his staff, and John Wooten suggests to him that he was kind of a little hesitant. Dick LeBeau, who was on the staff, defensive coordinator, the ownership wanted them to keep him. And he had no problem with that, even though Dick LeBeau, they ran a 3-4. Mike Tomlin was a 4-3 cover 2 guy, Tampa 2 with Tony Dungy.
Right.
So that's a really interesting aspect of it. John Wooten, who comes back into play again, convinced Mike. There was a coach on the staff, John Mitchell, who actually was the first black football player at Alabama under Bear Bryant. He was a defensive line coach. John Wooten suggested to Mike Tomlin, okay, look, this is what you do. I was a teammate of Dick LeBeau in Detroit, and I'm in Cleveland. I know him. He's a good guy. You promote John Mitchell to assistant head coach. That means you have him in like all the different rooms. Cyrus Meary, who you guys might remember was a partner with Johnny Cochran, and they got the Rooney Rule started. He's also plays a big role in the book. And he said basically, essentially what it was is this way, John Wooten felt like Mike Tomlin would have a black coach to watch his back or to have his back as a first-year coach. You got to remember, the Steelers had just won a Super Bowl the year before. Bill Cowher, his last year, they went 8-8, but the year before that, they won the Super Bowl. This is a veteran team, strong personalities. Now, they didn't want him. Soon after he gets there, Ben Roethlisberger, the quarterback, takes him to lunch and basically tells him, hey, you know what? You're going to have to earn these guys' trust because a lot of them didn't want you. Now, just imagine that. Okay, you're 34. You come take this job to the Pittsburgh Steelers. That's the greeting you get. And he basically went in there and did his thing and changed the way they did things, changed the way they practiced, pissed a lot of players off, practiced them hard, but basically came across a particular way that the players realized that he wasn't going to be a Bill Cowher. He was going to be him. And I guess either they could get on board or not. And the first year they go 10-6. They lose to Jacksonville in the first round of the playoffs.
Right.
Fire Mike Tomlin, fire, the media's already saying that. And next year, guess what? They win the Super Bowl. At that time, he was the youngest coach to win a Super Bowl. McVay came by a few years later, recently, and became the youngest. But until then, Mike Tomlin was the youngest. And a lot of the book is the build up to that point. The second half of the book, as I call it, details his years in Pittsburgh. And he had some years. He had some doozies. They went to another Super Bowl in his fourth year. They lost to Green Bay.
Yep.
And then came, he's had some 8-8 seasons. And then a lot of the book is dealing with him and Ben Roethlisberger. I'm not going to say it was a love-hate relationship. I think it was a tolerating relationship that he was the quarterback and that was his quarterback and he didn't really have a say in it. And that was going to be his guy. And, Ben's going to go to the Hall of Fame one day. But you had to deal with the issues. Two training camps in a row, they had press conferences the whole year because he had sexual assault allegations. So you got this young coach dealing with that. The one year they had to get another. He was suspended for 4 games.
Right.
And they came out 3-1. So there have been so many things. The need I mentioned Antonio Brown, as great as he was, all the issues that he had with Antonio Brown, Le'Veon Bell, as talented as he was. So he dealt with a lot of different things. And that's a lot of the story, just his resolve. But throughout it all, every year he won the Super Bowl because they were Bill Cowher's players.
Yeah.
And that has followed him throughout to where we're now at year 17. And if you looked at the Pittsburgh papers this week or listened to the talk shows, all you would hear is that, why haven't they fired this guy?
Yeah, I I was reading something today. They're calling it the Mike Tomlin era now, as in baseball, ERROR.
Yeah.
Hey, well, go ahead, Mike, because I want to get John on some of these other issues, and then I want to come back and close this thing out and let people know where they can get this book, John. and I can't wait to get a copy. But yeah, I'll let you finish it up, Michael.
All right. So, I had lived in Erie, Pennsylvania right before I met you. So I know that Western Pennsylvania is a scenario. But I was also a Steeler and Pirates fan when I was a kid back in the 70s. So, of course, I didn't find out till later about what happened with Joe Gilliam. Yeah. And then I really found out when they said in Al Davis's documentary that Terry Bradshaw came up to him after, with Gilliam as a starter, they lost to Oakland, and then that Al Davis assured him that he'll talk to Chuck Noll. Next thing you know, Terry Bradshaw was starting over Joe Gilliam, and then they ended up winning the Super Bowl. So he said he was more upset that they won 4 Super Bowls instead of him messing up the apple cart for Joe Gilliam. So what I'm trying to preface is all the stuff he was going through with the fans in Pittsburgh, that we talked about, that climate, and the media didn't really like seeing that black quarterback out there, especially from an HBCU, leading the team. And then later on, Dave Parker went through some stuff. They're throwing batteries at him because, the drug allegations, but also he was the first $1 million a year player. And a lot of that was on incentives, and I think they end up trying to give Nolan Ryan an actual $1 million contract right after that. But it was a lot of animosity towards these high-profile black players. So when you say you were involved in the media there, did you feel some of that still, coming over from decade to decade to decade to around the time you were there? Was it still that same attitude as, we talked about Barry Bonds, and let's not forget Bobby Bonilla, who's still getting paid, I think, by the Mets. But
best contract of all time.
Yeah, Bobby Bonilla was,
Bobby Bonilla Day.
Right. He was going through all that drama in Pittsburgh. Remember when Andy Van Slyke seemed to get more favoritism, and Barry and Bobby didn't like that. So did you have any of that? Like, it was like a combination of some of these writers that probably were still around in the 70s, 80s, and 90s and still around, and their same attitudes were there?
Yeah, I kind of had to just go in there and do my thing, because a lot of those guys, most of those guys were from Pittsburgh, grew up Steeler fans. So a lot of them were fans.
Yeah.
And so a lot of them was very personal for them.
Okay.
Which I think a lot of sports writers are like that, not just in Pittsburgh, but the Steelers are such a part of the fabric of the community of the area there. It's huge. So they take it personally. And then when you got to think about it, if Russ Grimm gets hired, I'm not going to say he's their drinking buddy, but he's a guy that they've known, a guy that they were comfortable with. So not only are you looking at Mike Tomlin and his color, but he had nothing to do with the Steelers. There was no connection. He was 34, younger than most of the reporters. So there was going to be no connection. He was not going to be their drinking buddy. He was not going to be a guy they could comfortably go up to and approach. So I think when you factored all of that in there, they were looking to poke holes into it. And, for him to win a Super Bowl in the second year, I mean, that was just, in the narrative following him throughout has been, he won with Bill Cowher's players. And I mean, I talked to Joey Porter for the book, and he talked about, he said, dude, we had teams that we thought were going to do great and didn't do great. He said, I don't know what they're talking about. He's like, there are no guarantees regardless of whose players you're coaching. He could not everybody, as Casey Hampton told me, who was a nose tackle, not everybody could have coached that team. It's talent, because remember they went 8-8, Cowher's last year.
Right.
So another coach could have gone in there and maybe couldn't.
Oh wow! 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 Somebody in Pittsburgh cut him out. Somebody in Pittsburgh did it. Wow!
I couldn't wait to hear what he said to finish that up. But we'll keep going, Mike, until hopefully we'll get JD back. And hey, I know your Brewers got swept, man. 2 out of 3 games. You have one.
They led both games though, Ricky. This was so bad about it. They're up 3-0 yesterday, and just casually let them come back. And then
guys,
they
I hit
blew it open.
hit the wrong button. Sorry.
Okay.
I mean, you got right to the point, man.
Okay.
I know. I mean, it was. I think it took a special person to coach that team.
Mm-hmm.
Such a strong locker room. And that was one of the things when I talked to Brad Childress, who was the Vikings coach. And I give him a lot of credit. He hired Mike Tomlin, very young as his first. That was his first year as a head coach. Interesting story. He actually wanted to hire Steve Spagnuolo, who's now the Kansas City Chiefs defensive coordinator. They were together with the Philadelphia Eagles.
Mm-hmm.
But Andy Reid, who was the Eagles coach at the time, who a lot of people know about, told him, no, leave him alone. You can't have him. So he went to this young guy he had been hearing about, Mike Tomlin, and made up his mind, I'm going to get this guy. So things really fell into place for Mike. And then I think the Vikings, they were number one in rush defense that 1 year he had with them. But Childress told me that Art Rooney II, who was the son of Dan, brother, who said basically, he asked Childress, well, what's it going to be like when he gets in front of the room, in front of the players? And Childress said he told him, well, he's going to look like a lot of the guys in the room, but he's going to tell you what he thinks, and he's not going to be afraid. And they gave a story of one of his former teammates actually at William and Mary. I'm forgetting his name right now. He's actually in jail right now. He was a Pro Bowl safety. I don't know why his name slipped me.
He's a frat brother.
He played for New Orleans.
And the Packers.
Sharper?
Yeah, Darren Sharper. They were together at William and Mary.
Right.
So he told the story of how, they went up against each other at William and Mary.
Right.
But then now he says Mike Tomlin now as a coach, he's got to deal with Darren Sharper as a player, and he observed how he dealt with him. And he told that to the Rooney's. He said, least of your worries is how he's going to be, dealing in front of the locker room. And Tampa Bay is really interesting. Rondé Barber, who's fantastic in the book, who just went to the Hall of Fame. Mike Tomlin put the jacket on him the night before. He had Mike Tomlin he credits Mike Tomlin with a large part of his career. And he went to Rondé Barber. It was John, the safety. I'm terrible with names.
John Lynch.
Yeah. John Lynch. So Mike Tomlin went in there, and John Lynch was actually, I think, older than Mike Tomlin. Right. So by the time he got to Pittsburgh, he had already dealt with players that were his age or older. So it was a big deal to the Pittsburgh media, but he had kind of that wasn't the first time he had ever dealt with that type of situation. So for us, the media, it was kind of, well, how's he going to do it? But he had already gone through that. So it was just him adjusting to the Pittsburgh Steelers and expectations.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I'm good.
Hey, at opening week of this NFL season, there were 16 African-American quarterbacks under center out of the 32 teams. What are your thoughts on the influx of the black quarterback in the NFL? You talk about the top quarterbacks in the NFL. Well, you go start with Patrick Mahomes.
Yep.
And you're going to have some of the best quarterbacks in the league are black starting. Practically everybody sits Mahomes at the top. Your thoughts on that from where you first started covering the league to where we are now?
I mean, the position has definitely evolved. The people that are involved with the Rooney Rule, they say, but they wanted to see the same thing happen with coaching. There's something about coaching. It has a different, especially in the NFL, it has a different persona, different perception. It's looked at as this leader. The quarterback's leader on the field, and teams now know they need a quarterback, regardless of what color he is, to win. But there's something about the coach that just really have not been able to get to that point yet. But as far as the quarterback, look at the draft, this past draft. You had, 3 black quarterbacks drafted in the first, 4 picks?
Yeah.
Anthony Richardson would never have been drafted, 10, 15 years ago. They would have said, he doesn't have enough experience. I mean, only started a handful of games at Florida.
Right.
They just threw him right into the starting lineup in the NFL.
And he's
That
playing
never would have
well.
happened before. They would have said he was an athlete.
Right.
He can't read defenses. They wouldn't, let alone draft him in the top 5. So yeah, the thought process has definitely changed. I mean, the USC quarterback this year, if he comes out, Caleb Williams will be the first pick. So yeah,
and might have 2 Heismans.
Yeah, and look at the college ranks now. I see players now, teams are playing quarterbacks, and you see kids are transferring. I know there's a kid at Texas State who was at LSU and Auburn, and he left there, and now he's at Texas State, just throwing the ball all over the place. And kids are now, like his black quarterbacks and their families are now looking, hey, you don't necessarily have to play at the biggest place, but you got to play. And coaches are saying, hey, I want this kid. I want to win, blah, blah, blah. So now they're plotting it's good to see now, they're plotting their strategies now, even at the college level. And it's continuing on, going to the NFL level.
I just saw Texas State beat the hell out of somebody.
Jackson State.
I'm like,
Jackson State.
Who was at Texas State? So it must have been that brother over there. Doing something.
And the coach was at a small school called Incarnate Word last year. He had a black quarterback there, and they led the nation in scoring. So what you're doing is now you go to a school where the coach, you look at the coach's track record. Does he play black quarterbacks? Does he have a wide open offense? Does that translate to the NFL? And that's what kids are doing now. You don't necessarily have to go to the biggest school. You need to go to the place that's going to fit your skill set, and you can get on tape and show the pro scouts what you can do.
Hey, we're running short of time here, but JD, I want to ask you about your thoughts on the impact of Deion Sanders at Colorado. Yeah. This whole thing from him going from Jackson State to where he is now.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, I know he interviewed at Auburn, I believe. I know he wanted the Florida State job, and I think it's wonderful what he's doing, empowering his kids. He's coming up in a very fortunate time with the NIL. So he's now able to, use his marketing skills and his ability, along with now the transfer portal and all of that. He always had the personality. So it's fascinating. It's fascinating to see how far it'll go, how long he'll be there, because other offers are going to be coming in. I mean,
You mentioned quarterbacks. Look at his son, Shador, is up there.
Sure, yeah.
And they just had the big matchup that everybody's waiting for. He didn't play as well, but he played pretty well in that comeback. But of course, everybody's looking at Caleb, and Caleb even had kind of a low-key game the last game before this one. So
yeah,
and there's people waiting for him to fall off. You know how that goes. So we'll see if that happens. But let's go back. Remember, Andre Ware was putting up great stats at Houston because of the way their system was. Then let's not forget how McNair had excellent stats coming in, but of course they discounted that because he was at Alcorn State. So there was a moment of it, but they didn't take it as serious. So this is probably the best time for black quarterbacks.
I was covering the Lions when they drafted Andre Ware. They didn't know what to do with him. Andre needs to be playing today.
Yeah,
he'd be a star in today. But back then, man, they didn't know what they were doing with that kid back then. John, just got a couple more minutes. I just want to you covered the NBA and you were one of the first guys I know that talked about analytics. You were one of the first. Tendex, I believe. Was
yes, sir. Dave Herron, great guy. Dave Herron.
I hope y'all getting a little kickback from that. Nobody else was talking about that. That was 25, 30 years ago.
We tried to sell that to several teams. Nobody wanted it. But Will Robinson was trying to sell it to Joe Dumars. He wouldn't. But Will Robinson, who was a historic scout, he loved it because I suggested several players and told him about it. He would match it up with what we told him. But it was definitely ahead of its time. Dave Herron, who originated it, was a great guy. I used it my covering of the Pistons. It was incredibly accurate. It still works today. It hasn't changed one bit. And I'll tell you the most interesting thing about it, Dave did who his top all-time player is?
Who?
you'll never guess. According to Tendex.
LeBron?
No.
Michael?
Somebody from back in the day?
No, yeah.
Wilt?
He's close. No.
Green?
Bill Russell?
Oscar Robertson.
Oscar Robertson.
No.
That makes sense.
Hey.
But I think I talked to Rick about it. It's not a complicated formula, but it takes a lot of. It's like the baseball stats now. It takes a lot of different stats, and you just end up with a 3-digit number, and that's how you rate. And that's how you rate the players. And it still works today. It's the only one I know that still does in the draft. They still don't really have a way of how do you rate college players, but Tendex does that.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that because a guy that I covered in Cleveland, I think Sports Illustrated or somebody had him analytically the best point guard in the league at the time. Right around the time we were, doing our coverage of the Bucks and the Pistons, it was Terrell Brandon.
Yeah, he had a very high Tendex rating.
Yeah, Terrell Brandon's. People are like, "Oh, what are you talking about?" I said, "Dude, he does all the analytics that they like." And I said, and I remember him playing behind Mark Price, and I said, "Brother, once you get your chance, you're gonna be an all-star." He said, "All right." And I ran into him years later. I said, "What did I tell you?"
Yeah. So he was a very good player.
Yeah.
Very good player.
Injuries messed him up, though.
Yeah.
John, do you think that the way teams are using analytics today, not only they use it in baseball, basketball, and football now, but I'm speaking more specifically with basketball and the 3-point shot. Do you think they're making the most efficient use of it?
I think they've misused it. I mean,
over
reliance on the 3-point shot. To me, it's just out of control. The game is just. I can't even watch it anymore. I mean, it's the ball. Everybody's just spread out. There's no real ball movement. It's just isolation, jacking up threes. I mean, as somebody who covered the league during the time that I did, it's very difficult for me to watch now.
Yeah, I agree.
Much more teamwork. Passing was much better back then. The guys passed, they moved it around. They shot the mid-range shot. You don't see guys shooting the mid-range jumpers anymore.
Right.
No.
Yeah.
And I agree with you too. And remember, I'm out here in the epicenter of this jacking up threes out here in the Bay Area.
So, at least they can make them.
Right. Yeah, but the whole thing though, like before they did win, when Barkley was saying, "Hey man, these jump shooting teams not gonna win because law of averages won't really work that way." But see, the thing about it is that they'll say that they defy the analytics or they capitalize on analytics. But if you really look at it, all 400 championships they had some tremendous breaks, and it didn't even have a lot to do with the whole analytic part of it. So that's the thing. Sometimes it just comes down to dumb luck.
Yeah, injuries.
Injuries, right?
Luck. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, JD, let's talk about this book again before we get out of here, man.
Okay. The book is called Tomlin. To me, that was the natural name. Tom. Everybody knows the name Tomlin, the soul of a football coach.
I love the jacket here, man.
Yeah, they did a great job on it. I told them the art department, they really hooked it up. Nice.
Colors
and a foreword by Tony Dungy. How did that come about?
Just I got to put a shameless plug in for my first book. I used him I did a book about Edgerrin James 2 years ago. And I talked to Tony Dungy because Tony Dungy, coached Edgerrin with the Colts. So he just remembered me, and I told him, and I said, "You're the perfect guy. I mean, you hired the guy. You hired Mike Tomlin. You gave him his first NFL job. He recommended him highly to Dan Rooney when they called him up and asked about him. So, and Tony Dungy, he made it a point. You look at the guys, Lovie Smith, Herm Edwards, Mike Tomlin, and then when he was with the Colts, he promoted Jim Caldwell. He stepped down so he could get the job. So who better to do Mike Tomlin's forward than Tony Dungy? And he was great. And so that, he made it. And once he did the forward, I felt completed that this is going to work, that his forward is great. He just describes how they first met. When he went to Indianapolis after he got fired in Tampa, he wanted to take Mike with him as a defensive coordinator, and they wouldn't let him take him.
Yeah. Yeah, and Tony quietly has been a force behind the scenes.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
People take the quietness for whatever, but I don't. I think I go by his actions, what he did.
Yeah.
Let me, guys. This is my first book.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Gold Teeth to Gold from Gold Teeth to Gold Jackets. Edwin James. Shameless plug. There you go.
Absolutely.
Also available on Amazon.
Well,
And
I got a quick question.
Go ahead, Mike. Go ahead.
Again?
Yeah. when we were doing the basketball around that time, you were in the Detroit area, and I believe Barry was still playing, right? 94, 95?
Yeah, he was there when I was there.
So did you have any interaction with him since you've done football too? So did you have any interaction with Barry? I know Ricky has.
No, I mean they would hook me up and get me to games, but I just was focused on the Pistons. I just did the NBA, but I followed him. I followed his career. I mean, he was unbelievable, running back. But I didn't cut in Toledo. I did a few, but he was already gone when I went to Toledo. He wasn't playing anymore. I don't think.
The Lions actually made it to the NFC title game. Believe it or not, 1991 they went 12-4.
Yep.
And went to DC. Washington ran all over. They blew
Wayne
out
Fonts, baby.
They blew out
Wayne Fonts.
Boys, and everybody.
Wayne Fonts. But Wayne Fonts never got the credit he deserved, right?
Yeah, he was a good
Wayne
coach.
Fonts.
Actually, he was a good coach. He was a good coach. It helps when you have number 20 though. In the backfield.
Well, but Herman Moore is pretty good too, though.
They had some talent.
They had some guys, man. Didn't have a quarterback. Didn't have the quarterback. Didn't know what to do with Andre. But we got to get out of here. But JD, you got to come back because there's a whole lot of other issues we want to get into. We just didn't have enough time to do.
You got my number.
Absolutely.
You got my number.
We will be checking in for JD Harris, my frat brother Michael Roberson, man. We let this little old Sigma guy come in and infiltrate us tonight, but that's all good. Hey,
wait. Let me just say this though. Do you realize that the Hoop Dream brothers, they're both Sigmas?
No, I didn't know that.
Yeah. So
my all-time favorite movie. My all-time favorite sports movie.
Yeah, Will Gates and AG, they're both Sigmas.
I love that movie.
Will's a friend of the show. I didn't know that. Wait till we get him back on, man.
I love that movie. I love it. That's a great movie.
Much success to you. Looking fantastic, brother. It is so good to catch up with you. Hey, check us out next week. We'll probably go next Wednesday. Until then, I'm Rick Hampton. Peace, everybody. Thanks, JD.
All right, y'all take care. Peace.
All right.
Peace.
All right.